without any further ado, I want to talk about the Upper Colorado River drainage basin in the prehistories into the 1800s. So we're going to see quite a few slides, and we're going to look at the different granaries. And the granaries down here in this part of the Colorado River drainage system are more elaborate. The one that you would say that, but I really got to be careful about saying that, because the ones up above in the Upper Colorado River Plateau are very advanced too, and very sophisticated also, but they're not as stylized. They're just numerous in some ways, but they're a different reason that they're building them. So we're going to look at the Colorado Plateau in the upper part of the basin on the Colorado-Utah border, and we're going to look at why certain granaries are there. A granary by concept is designed to store food, and they store a lot of different things in the granaries. They'll store corn, and they'll store sunflower seeds, and they'll store chenopodium, and anything that they need to keep in a dry place away from animals. One of the primary problems you have in the granary is just like you do in your cupboard at home, as you have mice wanting to get inside your cupboard, and it was a problem for them. Pack rats were the main source of entry into the structures, because they would dig through the rock, and so the design of the structure primarily was to be in a dry place, to be well sealed, and to keep rodents out of the granary, just like what we would do in our cupboards. Next slide, please. As you know, this is the drainage basin, and you can see that the Colorado River's waters begin in Wyoming, in Colorado, and come down through here and cut through the Colorado Plateau. 79% of the water in the Colorado River system comes out of Colorado, about 13 to 14% come out of Wyoming. And a negligible amount, I say that because it's Utah, but a large amount comes from Utah too, to the lower basin. The upper basin is dominated by canyons, just like the canyons down here, but they're a different type of canyons. And so it's all part of that uplifting process, and then the down cutting by the rivers. Powell said that the mountains uplift and the water down cuts. And of course, you know his story pretty well because you guys live here in the Page. But John Wesley Powell understood that the cutting through this was pretty important. After the years of spending here, and after driving back and forth between here and Wyoming weekly, basically, because that's where my primary residence is driving back to there, I started to call these people the canyon people. So the people that created these granaries, I think of them as canyon people. And there were multiple cultures. There are probably 30 different First Nation groups that have lived along the Colorado Plateau, and that build these elaborate structures for your time. Next slide, please.
Oh, good, perfect.
And if you look at this right here, it shows the amount of water flow that you have. And so it's supposed to be shown in this particular case is the amount of gallons that you have in the river system that flow down through it. Where these canyons were cut is where the people built their granaries, is up in the sides of the canyons. Some are out on I'll show you some mountain flats, but most of them are built up inside of canyon protective areas. Next slide, please. So the period of time that we're going to look at, well, that's right. The period of time that we're going to look at is between about 500 AD and 1500 AD. Some of it will go back to 300 AD, but it'd be 500 to 1500 AD. We know that they had storage facilities prior to that, but that the storage facilities prior to that were a little bit different. And so we're going to look at the ones that are primarily built out of stone and primarily built out of stick, but primarily use mud as the bonding agent for constructing the granary. Next slide, please. This is on the Gunnison River in Colorado. And why I'm showing this is, if you've ever come to a talk before, I've always talked about Eagle Rock. It's one of those laddered sites that goes back to 13,000 years ago. But at this site here, we found in the upper basin some of the oldest corn that we found. So we know the corn had reached this far north on the Gunnison River, which is near Delta, Colorado, just south of Grand Junction. We know corn had moved through Arizona, through New Mexico, into the upper part of the Colorado River Basin. Next slide. By about 2,000 years ago. This is where Eagle Rock Shelter is on the Gunnison. It's well watered, and that's real important. Next slide, please. And you can see the ladder 150 years ago, all the way down to 12,000 years ago. And about where the 6,000 years ago is, right up about here is where we found corn. Next slide, please. Sorry.
You're gonna fire me.
No, you're fine. Next slide, please. This is just showing the dates within this. That's okay. This is the maze that we found. Now, this is about 1940 plus or minus 40. If you add the 40, that's right about 2,000 years. If you take the other way, it could be 1900 years before present. But this is burned. So they're actually processing the corn right there at the site. Are they growing it at the site? We don't know. Are they getting it for trade? We don't know. But the one thing it is that once you begin to get corn, once you begin to plant corn in your area, you're tethered to it. Now, there's a great deal of argument, and I'll discuss this if we get this far into the lecture. There's a great deal of discussion about it. In the upper part of the Colorado River Basin, you have a phenomenal deer herd, phenomenal elk herd too, but the deer herd was just, it's a major source of protein. And then we had bison, but deer would eat corn. And once you started to grow corn, you were tethered to your field. You had to stay near your cornfield to keep animals from coming out there. Now, there is a problem, but if a deer would be stupid enough to come and eat your corn, shoot it, and that provides more calories. It's not the worst thing that ever happened. You'd have to eat a deer, because it just increases the calories. So there was a symbiotic relationship developed in the upper basin where that it was planting and tilling and harvesting deer that would come and eat. So you had somebody at the fields all the time. Well, the next thing that tethered you is you had to have the seed corn for the next year. You had to put it in a dry place that was sealed so that your corn would not rot in the course of the year. You had to make sure that it was in an area that was away from the critters at that point in time, because losing your seed corn was a disaster. And the other thing is that some people used to think, well, why would I go to all the trouble of growing corn when I could just steal it from the neighbors? And that might not mean that, the same cultural group, but a different cultural group would come over and say, hey, look at this granary, let's just take this corn out and, we'll just take it with us. So they were in secluded areas so that wouldn't happen too. So you had to put them in secluded areas, and I'll show you that in a moment. No, next slide, please. At the cook shelter that we excavated, you can see this hearth. And why I'm showing you this is that in this area where this clay rim is, these people are processing they're processing corn and they're mixing it. And we know exactly what they were cooking. They mixed it with animal fat, they mixed it with different types of critters, and pack rat, they'd eat anything that was in that area. Bobcat, they'd eat deer. But corn was the basic staple that they had, and they mixed it like you would with any other thing. They probably made tortillas, but they would bake it. And in this hearth right here, we found it was like an oven, a bake oven that was built here. And we found that they were commingling the corn with pinopodium and with other plants material there at this site. Next slide, please. So the macro and micro floral contents of feature 14, which this feature is, show a rich diversity of floral material being prepared in the feature. Charred pinoyam, pinopodium, via maize kernels recovered. In addition, several types of native plant resources appear to have been utilized, including blue splits, sunflower, grass seeds, and a member of the mustard family, possibly pepperweed. And why I'm bringing that up is you have a pretty robust diet. You know what you're going to get from your environment, and I think corn was added. If your corn crop failed, it wasn't the worst thing that happened to you in the upper part of the basin, because you relied on other wild plants like pinopodium, and you relied on sunflowers. You never had the total dependency upon maize that you had where there are larger populations, such as right here. Now that's a misnomer too, because everybody understood what their environment was like, what the carrying capacity would be like. So they had a good concept of how much corn they needed to grow, how many granaries they needed to have, how to make it through the year, and also how to set aside enough seed for the next year. Next slide, please. The granaries were constructed in a variety of areas. This granary I'll talk about in the end of this, but this was out on the floodplain. Very rarely did you find granaries out in the floodplain, but it only makes sense. If you're going to be there year round, why not have your granary close to where you're going to be, or have it in close proximity? But this is a little bit different. It's part of a complex that I'll discuss in a little bit in just a moment. So we're going to look specifically at granaries as advertised. Next slide, please. These pins right here are areas where we've studied maize. You can see that it's in Wyoming. You can see that it's in northwest Colorado, northeastern Utah. Just basically on the border, you have to get different permits for Utah. And even though we've got permits in Utah, in fact, we've only excavated inside of Colorado primarily and in Wyoming. Next slide, please. Where we've excavated, we find a difference in the type of granary. I don't think it's a cultural difference. I think it's acquisition of the materials that are there. What I've learned about granaries is you learn to build it so that it matches the natural environment where you're at. You make it from the clays, you make it from the wood, you make it from the stone that's right there in that area. But what it does is it creates a very distinct type of different grouping of granaries that look different. I don't know if it's culture preference or because of the fact that they're just taking what nature gives them and building their granary out of those particular items. And I'll go through them. So we have what we divided into the Browns Park, the Echo Park, and the Douglas Creek granary system that we're going to look at tonight, with primary focus on the Douglas Creek, but also discussion of Browns Park and Echo Park. Next slide, please. These are all in Colorado. The Shavetail Granary goes from right, if you see where the Wyoming border is, all the way down here to where the Gunnison is, just above the Gunnison River. So it's the upper part of the Colorado River Basin where I'm going to look at it, but it has application all throughout the Southwest or any place that you grow corn. Next slide, please. In 1927, they begin to look at the nature and construction of the granaries at Skull Creek, which is in present Dinosaur National Monument. And they looked at how these were made. And the fascinating thing is there is continuity in all the areas of how they're going to make it. Let's just use a simple one. Next slide, please. We'll use a simple example. You build the granary up, and here's the hypothetical one. It looks like a circle. You'll see that doesn't quite work. You build it up, you lay the stone down, you make it as nice as you can, and your granaries have to be wet laid. I'll show you dry laid masonry in a minute. That means you put no mortar between them. But when you're making a granary, you have to make it wet laid. So you have to take and put the mud inside of it to hold it so that the animals, the critters don't come in. And you put aggregate inside of that to make it hold together. And the top of it is wooden. And we reconstructed a granary, we excavated it and rebuilt it. It's because it collapsed because a cliff fell on it and we had to rebuild it. So we rebuilt it and we had to examine all these other ones and we kind of learned a little bit how they did it. In the deconstruction of the granary, we found that they took and they seared the wood. Wood is cut easier if you've got a stone implement. If you burn it at the edges and just cut it with the stone implement. But more than that, if you take and you put charcoal on the outside of it, so it keeps insects from boring into the wood. And more importantly, if the charcoal falls into the granary, the one best thing that you can keep insects out away from your corn is if you commingle it with ash, commingle it with charcoal. So there was a couple of things that were there, but they would lay these things across and put these vigas or these lattices across it. And then they put grass. In one case, you'll see they put corn cobs and then they put mud. And they made it look bell-shaped. It's really beautiful looking, like the one that we showed artistically. I'll show you one in a moment. Next slide, please. So when you came up and you built it up, so this is stone down here, and there's a coil right here, the coil method I'll talk about. At this granary that dates to 870 BP, they took and they coiled it up over the top. So they took the mud and they bent it over the top to make it look beehive shaped. I don't want to look say beehive shaped because they're not all that way. But you coiled it over the top and then you sealed it so that with this cap right here, you had to make sure that you had a tight seal over the top of the wood. So this capped the wood and it was coiled over the top. Most times you don't see those sticks sticking out. I'll show you some in a moment to show this instance, but you leave those sticks sticking out. You cap it with mud. Next slide, please. Okay, this is collapsed, so you can see how the logs came down. Now, what happened here? I don't know if you'll be able to see this outside, but if you look at the bottom of this, you'll see a rim of rock. That is the foundation. The one that we just recorded last week had a wood foundation, which is really rare, but they had a wood foundation at the bottom because I think they thought it was good and dry. And besides that, they used juniper, which does not rot because it's seeded. So they built on top of it, but the foundation slumped. When that foundation slumped, the front part of the granary fell downhill, but that was post-abandonment. That was after they stopped using the granary that this occurred. So you can see that they put it on a layer of stone all the way around. It was foundational, put it up, laid a course of stone, then mud, coarse stone, mud, coarse stone, mud, and then all the way up. And they used coils in there, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is one of the better granaries that we found. We put a light inside of it, but it's complete. The only thing that you see is where the rodents climbed in there after they abandoned it. And they climbed in there and they took out whatever little grain they wanted or roughage that they wanted. This is in Douglas Creek, but this one beside it is built just like it. And this fascinated me. Look how that it bevels up. Look how the foundation goes up so that it's narrower at the bottom and wider at the top. And that floored me because when we had to reconstruct our granary, that did not make sense. We build in a pyramidal form where our base is wider than our top so that it doesn't collapse, it doesn't fall down. But they built these with this honeycomb shape so that the bottom was narrow. And that is actually not an abnormality. It happens in a lot of them. Where the bottom is narrower than the top, it comes up in curves. Next slide, please.
Doc, okay, you
Go
probably upper left there, is that a picture of the opening?
Yeah, that's a picture of the opening. Yes, very good. Yeah, that's a picture of the opening. So then they would cap that with a stone slab. And sometimes, I'll show you one in a moment, sometimes that stone slab will cover the whole top part of it, but the slabs are massy. In that cook shelter where I showed you where they had that feature where they were cooking the corn and the kinipodium and stuff like that, the top slab was about this big, but we think that was a structural slab to keep it from coming into the building, the larger building. Next slide, please. So this is that same one, and it dates to 990 plus or minus 40 BP. That 990 date is important because it looks like that the Southwest in the Colorado Plateau had some of its best years between 800 and 1200. 1200, you know, there's a drought. Everybody talks about the great drought in the American Southwest. And what people forget is people like the Hopi have been able to adjust to maybe 8 inches of moisture where they're at because they changed their practices in agriculture. So, but there was a major sweet spot in the American Southwest between about 800 and 1100, 800 and 1000, depends on who you're listening to or where you're at, because the weather varies. That's why the neighbor across the street gets rain and you don't. There's so many variables. You don't know what those variables are, and we try to explain those things. But there's a sweet spot. And you'll see this 900-year-old date, but I'll talk to you about that in just a moment. Next slide, please. This is a structure where you have to crawl in underneath the bottom. Next slide. And they built this lattice form structure right in the side of it. And they put these sticks up with willows, and then they covered it completely with mud. And they tied it together with twine or with bark, and they held the whole thing together and they covered it. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you look in the center, there's a round hole about like this. It's different colored. That's where the pack rat would come in and they catch pack rat holes. That's something you find in common among a lot of the rock art sites. Inside of the excavations at Eagle Point, we know that they ate pack rats. So it wasn't so bad that you had a large rat inside your granary. If you could kill it and eat it, I mean, you just, the reciprocity. Okay, next, not quite reciprocity. But this is another picture of it, just kind of showing the elaborate nature of the stonework that's there and how they twined it together. That twining is almost on all of the granaries where they actually took and wove it. And then it's wet when they put it on the outside of the wood. It's wet, but when they put that wet mud on the outside, it's like putting glue on the outside of it. So that glue holds it forever in place. So that's why this one lasted for, it was built in 800, I believe. I think I have the date earlier. 700 years ago. Next slide, please. I really do like the amount of latticing that's here. And when you tie in a knot, it depends on if your dad taught you, depends on if you're a sailor, depends on if you're in the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, where you tie the knot. We have a certain way of tying the knots. To me, they all look backwards, and I think they are, but they're not backwards. That's just the way they tie the knot. So instead of going clockwise and they're not tying it, it's to me that they went counterclockwise on some of these, or they were left-handed. One of the two, and they, it's hard to try to attribute cultural things to certain things, but it's really cool to do the analysis of them. Next slide, please.
Is that wattle and daub, or is that just a lattice work?
It's lattice work, completely lattice, no stone. This is completely lattice work. So it's like making this huge basket with willow and then covering it completely with mud and then weaving it together to joints. Yes, good observation. There's no stone in this one. So at this one right here, you have no stone. And you can see how well the roof of it is done. It's really well, it's extremely well done, but you have to crawl down. The person that found it, her name was Heidi, was working on our crew. Walked up and she was coming in. She says, "Oh, there's something there." And she got on her knees and had to crawl in there. You cannot see it. Now that proves the point, or attributes to the point. You don't want anybody to find your granaries. It's not something you want everybody to find. And at the end of this, if we get this far along, at the end of this is kind of explained. This would be close to the Uinta granaries, and maybe they weren't there year round, and they wanted to make sure that their corn was there when they came back. They didn't eat it all and left it there for the next year. Next slide, please. Okay, this is right near this one, 870, and it's a little bit different. And this was just full of corn. The cobs were left there. Now, what happens is why They probably intended to come back. Why they left that many cobs in there, I think was eaten up by rodents over time because there's nobody there to protect them. I think it was just because of the fact that they had excess food. They didn't need to go back to it, or they changed patterns or whatever happened. You know, they changed it. But this one was full of corn. Next slide, please. This right here shows the way that they put the mud here, but this is a common theme here. Is you put the mud in, and I'll show you some in a moment that have finger imprints in it. They all do, but you could, beauty of it is you can go see their fingerprints in it. You take photographs of the fingerprints, and it's really, really pretty cool because that puts you in touch with their hand-to-hand manufacturing of these particular items. Next
Are
slide.
you looking
please.
down?
Look, oh, this one is a good question. Yes, we're looking down.
So that bigger rock is on the top of it?
Yeah, part of it. Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah. Okay, this is the interior of that structure that you just saw with a stone wall on the outside, but it's different. They use slabs to do it. So there's variation, but this is within a crevice. These crevice granaries are pretty intriguing. They're walled off like this, and they found them all over the place, but they're just a little bit different modification, a different way of doing it, but they're taking advantage of what nature gives them. They could create this granary inside this crevice. They could put a good stone wall here. They didn't lay it course by course. They did it by doing it slabbed. And that's just because they're taking advantage of what nature gives them. Next slide, please. This is a different granary. Is that actually that granary that we just looking at? And it shows the tying on it. And you can see there's like 3 layers of sticks, one at the bottom, one in the middle, and then, well, actually like 4, but I think it's a distortion. I think it's 3 layers, and then you put the stone on top. They made it so that it would support the stone that you put on top of it. Next slide, please. This is the corn with inside it. I said there was a lot of it in it. This is the corn inside that structure that you just saw, where we were asking about where the entry is, but this is on the opposite side where you had to collapse. Next slide, please. Okay, Winger in 1956 divided these things into granary types. So he had double ones, triple ones, and then he talked about the way that the lid was and latticing, but he looked at this as if there were some of them, there were the 3 of them, and I'm going to talk about that again in a moment too. But keep in mind that one that's the outlier on the top. One of the sites that we recorded, we assumed that was a granary, and we learned later on that it's not. It was a place for cooking. Now, I don't know from Winger's 1956 drawing if that's the case, but we do know that from the site that we've excavated where they actually had these cookers. And why I showed you that feature number 14 at Cook is because it looks like they made clay rim things and they roasted corn in it, because we found the roasted corn there also. It makes a lot of sense if you're trying to keep rodents away from your corn to take and put it over ash, or take and cook it, or take and smoke it so that your corn is smoked. It doesn't hurt the quality of the corn if you're going to grind it and make it into meal. It's just a good idea. So these are the types that he thought could identify in 1956, and they're from Lizard Canyon, which is on the south side of Dinosaur National Monument. Next slide, please. This is Winger's 5MF 374 up in the Lizard Canyon area, and you can see it's almost complete. That is almost still complete to this day. It's almost complete at this point in time. Next slide, please. There it is right there. Okay, so you can see it, and we went and analyzed this to see how they did sticks, so that when we rebuilt our granary, that we did it in similar to the way that they did it here, and it's not too far from the granary that we excavated. Next slide, please. So this shows in 1956, it shows some key elements to it, but what we got fascinated with was how they cut the sticks. Now, you could take and beat the sticks and cut them, but there's irregularity in it. If you take and run a fire around the edge of it and then take and cut it off, that works real well. And in fact, that's a common feature in most of the granaries is burnt cut wood. So it was 2 things: you burn it and get it so that you don't have so much to cut through, and then cut it with a stone axe. Next slide, please, for making your roofs. This is Jason LaBelle. He's at Colorado State University. This is his scanning of it, where we're doing digital scanning. And what now we do is LiDAR scanning of our granaries. We can measure. This is a LiDAR scanning of that particular granary that Winger recorded. Next slide, please. And this is our site that we found, 5RB705. This was recorded by Stephen Priestman in 1977. And this is exactly what it looked like. It was in perfect condition. He says the entry is 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters. And because of the fact that Steve is pretty meticulous, we know that the entry was probably that size. But what always got me is, why was it so small? But we reconstructed it that way. Next slide, please. So 705 in 1977 collapsed because water poured down behind the cliff. It fell down on it and pushed it out. Next slide, please. So this is what we found. And the BLM contracted us to restore it. National Park Service was going to charge them $35,000. And Western Wyoming College had a cooperative agreement with them where we could run our field schools there. We did it for considerably less than $35,000, but we reconstructed it. But I'd like to point out a couple of things. You can see the beams in it. You can see that it's tapered up, that it tapers up. Now that's the thing that confused me on the other ones. It tapers up instead of having that narrow part at the top. So it's wider at the bottom, narrower at the top. That just shows there's variability in the way that people are doing it, but you can see the great amount of sticks. Next slide, please. So we had to do archaeological excavations of this, and we've got over 300 corn cobs from inside the interior of the structure. And there's a reason for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what it looked like when we stripped it down. And this is a profile of the structure that we had to reconstruct. That means we have to rebuild the entire thing and put it back like it was. Next slide, please. And what we found is that they used corn to support the top of it. So they carried the mud up there and they put the corn in it to hold it together, to bond it, just like you would rebar, but they used corn cobs to hold it together and put it over the top of the latticing. And I know why they do this is because it's lighter. It's not heavy. It's not heavy like rebar. It's not heavy like stick, but it bonds really well and the thing doesn't crack very much. Next slide, please. Oh, you saw the date. I'm sorry, I need to go back to that date. Keep that date in mind, 850. So anyway, so this is what they used for rebar here, but 850, just keep that as general mind. Next slide, please. Okay, and they also had sticks that went across it. So the stick imprints are seen inside of the mud. Next slide, please. And you can see where they have the twigs in there. You see sandstone inside of it, and this is the daub from it. We took and we heated it up to see what kind of, how hot it would get, to see what the changes in the properties of the daub would be, and you'll see why in a moment. But we heated it up because we had raw material there. And so this is a heated up example of it. And I think it got to 1600 degrees Celsius. It was pretty high, pretty hot heat. We took it. It doesn't vitrify. It doesn't turn into clay. You couldn't use it to make pottery, but it does a real good job of bonding together things. It's just like the mud around here. It's as slick as snot when it's wet, and it's as hard as concrete when it's dry. So this is exactly the same kind of properties you've got with inside of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so you can see the sticks from the cross members. They were willow. Next slide, please. And they had been bound on the top. We found some of these ties on it. Next slide, please. And these were the ties that we found, and they were on sticks still. So we took and we measured and analyzed each one of the ties so that we could discuss what the nature of them was. They're all from willow. They're primarily from willow bark is what they use. Some are from serviceberry bark. They were the primary source of twining. Next slide, please. The sticks recovered from the daub were identified as willow and indicated that a member of the willow family was collected in the riparian environment. Now, this is important. They go down and get the willow off of the floodplain, and they get the mud from the floodplain right there too. Next slide, please. Well, you can see the fingerprints here. When we started rebuilding this thing, we had to carry in 5-gallon jugs of water 1 mile to bring enough water. And we had to pack in the adobe, the right kind of adobe, 1/4 of a mile. So we got to thinking about it. Is what we think that they did was not carry both of those things, because in archaeology we have one rule that works: you carry the heaviest thing the least farthest. We think that they coiled it in the mud in the creek and made coils and carried coils there, and that's why everything has got these coil marks in it. They're laying out these coils of mud and then straightening it out and taking their fingers in and printing it to hold the coils together. Next slide, please. And we thought that they probably carried it on their back, the coils on their back, and carried it to the site. Next slide, please. Or on their head, like is traditional. But the one thing that we do know is that this coil, that it came in coil form. This got the curve to it. We know that it was in coil form. And a lot of the granaries that we've recorded are just coils stacked on top of each other. Next slide, please. This is a coil joint in the daub. You can see the coil joint, and this is after heating it, showed even better. Next slide, please. And this is what the reconstructed granary looks like after we get it up partially. Now, notice we dated another corn cob this past year, and it's 970. Now, it kind of bummed me because archaeologists would like everything to be the same time, but actually, it's pretty cool. They stored corn in this structure for about 110, 120 years. So they reused it. So they had different kinds of corn cobs. So for 120 years, they used this particular storage facility to put their grain into. So that's cool. That's cool because these are all corn cob dates. They're not dates from the sticks, corn cob dates. Next slide. We got it to the top like this, and this created all kinds of problems for us. So we got it in the cold form. Next slide, please. Then we had to put the cap on. The cap we did exactly like we described to you. We took and laid out the sticks across the top of it, but we cheated a little bit just so if you ever go back and do the excavation on it, see what we did. We used juniper in addition to willow. We use juniper as a principal beam across, but we've also found that in other granaries now. It's a principal support. And then we used willow, but we burned all of them. Okay, this has now stood for 21 years. And what I told the crew is this lasted 1,300 years. Ours needed to at least last till we died so that nobody could say we did a bad job. But it's good enough that the crew could stand on top of it and work inside of it. And you can still stand on it to this day and there's no loss. Your biggest problem is down at the bottom for drainage. We had to why the cliff fell is because water got behind it and saturated down. We had to rechannel the creek up above it. Not a creek, it's just a little drainage, that comes from flash floods. We had to rechannel the creek above it and it's worked. And so that has worked. Next slide, please. And that little thing up there on the top covers that 20-centimeter hole that was there. And it looks a lot like it. What we used was rammed earth, and that's more technical. It's 1 part concrete, 5 parts earth to make this part. So that we did it this way. The National Park Service requires that you make it look different than the original, and the rammed earth makes it look different than the original. Next slide, please. This just shows the top of it with an opening, and the opening follows the openings on the other one where it's smoothed on the inside, and it's just like the other ones. Next slide, please. Okay, now there are 2 other granaries besides this, and they're all coiled, and then there's this cooker over here. So we had to excavate this because they wanted to restore that granary, so we excavated it. And what we found was there's corn cobs inside of this particular structure on the left. It's only about 2 meters or about 6 feet away from the other granary. And this is where they were cooking their corn and preparing it for putting inside of it. We don't think they were doing it to prepare meals because technically it's good to have a picnic in a nice, pretty place like this is located, but there's no place to sit. So we think that they're just searing it right there. I mean, it really worked really well. Next slide, please. And it dated to 900. So it's contemporaneous with those dates that we just showed you. So 900 plus or minus 70, the corn cob out of there now. Again, these are all corn cob dates. Next slide, please.
So remind me what the BP stands for.
Oh, BP stands for before present. That's the best way that I like to put it. It's actually before 1950, and it deals with when they discovered radiocarbon dating. And they've got it better. If you'll notice, this date is plus or minus 70 on the corn cob. If you notice the one that I got from UGA just this year, I got from UGA this year was plus or minus 20. They've gotten so good at it, they can refine it down to just perfection because they've had a lot of things they can do tree ring dating and they can calibrate it. It's a calibration thing that's pretty critical. The other thing too, you got to watch me when we get down these choo-choo tracks. We've worked in Mongolia for the last 9, 12, 11 years. And they did studies on the trees in Mongolia, and they found that when they're in stress like this, they absorb less carbon. What does that mean for radiocarbon dating? So rather than offing radiocarbon, they haven't did. I mean, rather than absorbing, they have to do off radiocarbon. I mean, carbon, not radiocarbon, carbon. So we don't know what temperature variation does for tree rings or for the absorption of carbon. So those are refined carbon things that we can go forward. That's hypothetical. We don't know what the effect of it is. We just know that from the trees that we've studied in Mongolia, that they have a tendency to off carbon in really dry years rather than absorb carbon, like when we think about what trees do, absorb carbon dioxide. The next slide.
So how can you identify that as a cooker as opposed to, say, an incomplete or here?
Oh, well, we'll go back. The one thing you can't see here, because when we restored it, I didn't have the restored one here. See that top part? It's got that round cap over the top of it. So it's capped on the top, it's smoothed on the top. So that's been smoothed on the top of it. When it crumbled, it makes it look like it was incomplete, but you could see where they had capped it off. So that's it. That's the total height of it. And so they had smoothed the top of it off. Then the oxidation on the inside of it, and that's on bedrock. So it's just on bedrock. So you can see the oxidation and the charcoal inside of it. So, but it's only about this big around. So it's not very big.
So is it basically a fire ring?
Yes, except that we think that they did this inside their structures on the vernal area where they put those clay rims around it and then that clay radiates back. That hearth that I showed, the feature 14, had been reused at least 7 or 8 times. We have 7 or 8 different dates from it that are within the frame of the occupation of the site, but that's because they empty it out, put back in a new set of charcoal, but not all charcoal gets swept out of it. So you're going to have more dates. What we're dating in these things is annuals. We don't date wood from those. We date like chenopodium, we date like grasses, we date like sunflower stalks, or we date corn, because then it only absorbs radiocarbon for that one annual year, radioactive carbon for that one annual year that it lives. So these are dates from annuals in both that hearth that you saw there, the feature 14. And I probably didn't set that up properly, but it's really intriguing to me. But I'm pretty sure that they emptied it out and then, you know, okay, this is Shavetail Basin, and this site right here is a really interesting granary. We had maize that dated to 1030 plus or minus 90. Again, it was done a long time ago, over 20 years ago. Well, not 20 years, 15 years ago, and the radiocarbon dating was not that good, but it was from maize. Next slide, please. Here's mudloaf, which dates to 329, and it's a maize date. But you can see the coil, and I put this in here because you can see how the coil is between the layers of stone. So you can see the stone, the coil, the stone, etc. Next slide, please. This is from a site that's collapsed that we call Kelby Granary, and it's collapsed. Next slide, please. But the intriguing thing about these sites is that they're a little bit different. This is the one that I was going to tell you about. It dates to 1030 plus or minus 20. We call it Lucas number 4 because of the BLM archaeologists that found it. That slab up on top, you see the pack rat maiden on top. That slab on top covers the entire length of this granary. It's completely sealed by that top level right there. And then the pack rat lives on top of it. And that becomes a problem. Next slide, please.
So that pack rat's only been living there in the last few years.
Pack rats can, some of them date to 300 years of age. They just live there over and over and over again. And so we kind of joked about it because we had to fight the pack rats at the site that we reconstructed. They didn't see it as a new granary. They saw it as a condominium come where they're going to have. So it's a really opportunistic thing for the pack rats to live on top of this. And I'll show you how this could be a problem. Next slide. Okay. This is the one that we just recorded that I was talking about. We had the 7-mile hike and we had to go in there. There's a granary inside of there. It faces north, which is not necessarily common. Doesn't matter, but it's in a really good little niche. It's in a perfect area. It's really secluded. So it's really out of the way. Next slide, please. And it's two rims right here. But if you notice, the entire roof is oxidized. Where you see that white on the back, it got so hot in there that it spalled off. Next slide, please. The reason is that on top of it, this is the top of the granary. On top of that wood right there, they built a pack rat nest like what you just saw at the Lucas number 4. This is Lucas 5. They built a pack rat nest on top of that. And either through a forest fire or something else, it caught the pack rat on fire. Now remember that is it's dung, and that manure is what we burn in Mongolia for cooking and for keeping insects out. But I mean, dung is a really valuable source of heating when it's dried out. These pack rat middens are a mixture of sticks, like you saw in the last one, and a mixture of that dung, and it burned the whole thing off all the way across, which is really intriguing. Next slide. And this is an oddity is why I'm showing you this. These were done with our LiDAR where we scanned it in so we could get precise measurements. We can go back and do measurements like right now I could go to my phone, it's on my phone, and pull it up on my scanner and do a measurement of a particular stone in its case. Next slide, please. These right here are, you can see where the ribs of the top of the wood was. You can see the twigs inside of this one, and you can see the daub. You can see on that one over there on the top part up there, you can see the sticks were set up upright. They call it the Kayenta style of construction sometime from Kayenta here, where they put them upright, like what you saw inside of that one granary where it's just nothing but wood. But this is a stone one, and it wasn't a very deep one. Next slide, please. This is a burned piece of daub, and I hope it shows up. But see, this is the daub. You see the stick sticking out, and you see the stick poking out at you right here at this point in time. It baked the stick inside of it. It got so hot, that fire was so hot from that pack rat dung burn that it literally baked the wood inside of it. It didn't catch on fire like you'd see a plane. It couldn't happen because there wasn't enough oxygen coming into it. So it baked it solid. The whole thing is burned all the way through. We're going to send that out for radiocarbonates to the University of Georgia to see what kind of date we can get by that. But we have to explain to them what the condition was that this was in. We pull those sticks out of there for dating. I would suggest that they're willow. There could be juniper, but I think that they're willow sticks here, even though that far high up. Next slide, please. Okay, this was a double roaster inside of this one that we recorded just now. It was two bin, not a double roaster, two bin granary. Next slide, please. And at this particular location, they have it's set on top of a juniper foundation instead of stone. They have juniper, but because it's so dry in there, we think that this is probably at least 1,000 years old. It has not rotted in 1,000 years because the dry condition in that was what they used for the foundation was wood instead of stone. Next slide, please, or at least as a footer. Now, this is a granary complex, and I don't have much time. Right? Okay, this is a granary complex. That side up there is a pueblo, would be what you call pueblo. It's a multi-room structure. It's called the Edge site. It's got a different name in Colorado now. But Colorado State University excavated that in 1979. We worked on it. And so we found everything that you would find within inside of the structure that was on the outside. Next slide, please. This is dry lake masonry for the structure that's on the edge site. Now, why I'm showing you this is that at this edge site, we know that we have a settlement here, that you have at least maybe 5 to 20 people living at this particular site. There are 4 granaries in close proximity to this site. And the why of it is that there's excellent area to grow corn right down below the edge site right there. So they were producing excess amounts of corn. Next slide, please. So this is the edge site. This is the valley of Douglas Creek. There's this tributary right here, and that becomes important in a moment. There's this tributary. So where these two creeks come together is an excellent place to grow maize because you're always going to have the right amount of moisture. Now, just like with a Hopi, some would plant sometimes in the alluvium down in the bottom of the valley. Some would plant up a little higher, so that if you had flash floods, as you guys, I don't have to explain that to anybody here. Next slide, please. This is one of the granaries. So this is what we call granary one. Next slide, please. And we mapped it, and it had this huge pack rat midden in the back of it. So where Martin is standing right here, this was the corpus of the granary that we could see, but this was completely covered. Now, you don't want to start digging into pack rat middens. Part of it is because they carry artifacts back up into them. You've got to be very careful dismantling a pack rat midden. One of my jobs in 1978 was to take apart a pack rat midden. I stayed in archaeology, but I don't know why. They carry artifacts, they carry projectile points, they carry other stuff in it, but it's not anything you want to dig because they put cactus inside there to keep critters out of it. It's just on it goes. And it snakes. Okay, next slide, please. So this is one granary. This is the second granary. You can't see it, but you're walking up to that edge site that we saw up there. The granary sits inside of here. It's out of sight. Now, it's not out of sight for the people that live at the edge site because they know that the granary is there. It's just like 50 meters from where their houses are. Next slide, please. And you can see the slope. Now, where Martin is on the slope right here, but where the granary sits is back tucked in underneath here. Next slide, please. And it's pretty elaborate. It's a double granary. It's a double piece right here, and it's fallen down in front because where the drip line is back down where the foundation was laid, so it just collapsed outwards. Next slide, please. There's the walls of the northern one of the granaries. It's 2 of them together. This is the walls of the northern one. This is the size of it here. The scale is 10 centimeters. Next slide, please. Now, from this site, you can look across the valley, and there's another one across the valley uphill. Next slide, please. And it sits tucked away in this part right here. And you can kind of see it in the far corner here. Next slide, please. This has suffered quite a bit over the years. We first recorded this in the 70s, and we've lost a lot of it. But the back wall underneath it is in pretty good shape. Next slide, please. So this back here is the back wall up against the inside of the granary. The front wall would have been out in front. There is nothing behind this. They did put a black wall, which they normally didn't do. They usually use the back of the rock shelter for the granary storage. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the edge site from that other granary. The granary we're just at, that's looking back at the edge site, and the edge site sits right there. Next slide. please. Down below it, there's rock art. And I wasn't going to put this in here because there's a debate about it, but this is a man walking his bear. He's literally got a leash. He's got a grizzly bear. You see the hump there? So he's walking his bear. I just wanted to show you how tough these people really were. I didn't show you that they're pet grizzly bear. I'll tell you, that's a good way to keep people away from the grain, you know? So that's one other thing. You had watch bears. That's made up. Okay, but the rock art is legitimate. Okay, this is a valley floor rock granary that's out in the valley. And we excavated it. We only found burned corn cob in there, but it was a cone granary like that one that you saw earlier that was an incomplete one. It was cone granary, but it burned. And so it left these imprints, it left these beautiful stick imprints. And so like you have this brickyard around there where all of these things are from the adobe, where all the wood burned, and there's none of the wood burned, but you've got this beautiful adobe outline. So what we've got is 4 granaries associated with that one site. They're contemporaneous, we think. Next slide, please. You can see him holding this, but down below him is why I put this in. You can see the number of pieces of daub that have burned that abate. Next slide, please. That's one with a stick in it. It shows how hot that got inside of there. Next slide, please. We excavated this in 726. It's got lope on there. We excavated this in 78. And we dug and we dug and we dug. And I'm going to tell this on my boss. He did not want us to use gasoline to get rid of the ants. This is real softer here. So the ants had made a hide there. So we would have to screen. We had these red ants and you throw the dirt into the screen and you shake it and you move away. The digger didn't have any problem, but the screener had a problem. So we took turns and shifts. But yeah. There's no more ants there, just so you know, we eradicated them. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Kelby granary. Next slide. And the reason I'm showing you this is it's up against the type of rock. But the other thing, next slide, please, is it's got this beautiful small rock complex. Chaco does that. They put real small rocks in there to hold it up. So these are all within a small area. These all date from the same period of time, but you see the variation in the construction of the granary. There's no such thing as, hey, you got to build your granaries this way. You got to build your granaries that way. But you can see the small rocks that are used here, and you can see the burned rock across it. Now, this was purposely cut, and this I don't understand. Next slide, please. This is some of the sticks in the adobe. Next slide. And you can see how small the rock are in here. I love it. I really do like it. And you could say, well, it's to keep the pack rats out, but it's not that way in other places. Next slide, please. And there you can see where they're cut off. Now, they cut this off on purpose. So they didn't want it to penetrate the entire roof length. They just cut it off at this point, and it's purposeful. So it's cut off. There's no other burning around it. This was pre-placement inside of the granary. And I think it extended outwards to provide some balance so it wouldn't slide down the hill. So I think that this is my thinking. They put the logs back out. So here's the wall. They put the logs back out so that the logs would hold the thing in place. I don't know. I'm speculating. Next slide, please. This shows again that cutting that we showed earlier, and it's pretty remarkable. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move up to where the granaries are smaller. And next slide, up to the north side of the Uintas, and look towards what we call Flaming Gorge and towards the Wyoming side. Next slide, please. And we're going to look at these catches like we've got at Shavetail, where you've got a lot of corn. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And you can see that they're caught in crevices, so that they're using these granaries for crevices. Now, I'm going to hold my judgment out on this. This could be habitation. It might not be granary. But the next things are, this is 960. And the next things are their habitations. So about 5 more after this one. Oh, wait. So the argument is that maize, a research question, what's the role of maize in low-level food preparation for the Fremont? That's what we call this group. I'm not going to go through this. Maize was used for tactical purposes in order to maintain forage efficiency and sustain hunter-gatherer economies. What I've left out of this discussion is the amount of buffalo that we found at some of these sites. And they would cross the Uintas and hunt buffalo, and they would take their corn with them, either for trade or for purpose of keeping there. Next slide, please. But you can see where these green spots are, where there's groundstone and ceramics, and you can see where the stars are. That's where Fremont storage was. So these people would come here seasonally to hunt. Next slide, please. And his premise is that made storage in uplands allowed for protracted presence in uplands, and logistical groups could travel further and stay longer than they would otherwise and provide greater access to large game. Why I throw this in here is because of the fact that there are multiple reasons for these granaries to be put there. Number one, it was a catch. You had your grocery store with you. You could extend your period of time it was there. If you killed a buffalo, you processed it, you had enough meat to last a year, essentially, for a family of four. I mean, you just seen buffalo. And if you butchered a cow, you know how long that would last. If you dry it, now drying and smoking is the most common way to preserve it. If you dried it and you had it last that longer, it made sense to build granaries and have them for storage places. You could stay on the hunt longer till you got the animal that you desired. You weren't just going to hunt deer. Deer was accessible in the place that I just showed you. You were going to hunt bison. Bison are accessible where we're at. At Cook Shelter, where I showed you feature 14, they killed at least 2 buffalo down the road. They're somewhere in close proximity because they carried large bones into it. When you kill a buffalo, you try to carry the heaviest things the least farthest, you reduce down the bone size. So we know that bison are killed at a certain place based on the size of bone that are brought back to the shelter place where you're going to live. So I've given you a lot of information and I want you to ask questions because it's better to these. Well, go to that next slide. Yeah, we'll leave it at this next slide. Yeah, because that shows storage facilities in the upper parts of the U.S. But
so like Chaco Canyon
yeah,
would be something like this because they were there for a long time, and then they just upped and left.
Chaco's such a totally different thing. I got my PhD at the University of Mexico and I took archaeological theory there. And most of my friends in that class studied Chaco. And there's as many opinions as there are people.
Okay.
But Chaco was a geopolitical controlled place. And Chaco probably did it for a different reason. They probably left for different reasons. But what is really important to understand is that they did not abandon this region. The Hopi Pueblos, the Zuni Pueblos of Acoma are contemporaneous with the building of Chaco. So you still have people staying in this area after Chaco is no longer Chaco.
Mhm.
So the Hopi Zuni Acoma are primary examples of people that are still here that are settled that don't leave. Something happened. Something happened. There's all kinds of theories about it. If I start giving theories, then I can lose my archaeology badge.
It doesn't stop you from lying.
Yeah, well, I don't want to laugh.
And so what about Mesa Verde? I know this.
So that's a real intriguing question too. Mesa Verde is in the perfect position that it's at. And we went to a tour. We used to always take our students that were working up here down to Mesa Verde. And we heard this tour guy give a discussion about it. It says, Mesa Verde wasn't abandoned overnight. Think about people my age, I'm 70, and they say, you've got to move. Well, they don't have a car, and I don't think I'd want to move. And they stayed. And you can see repairs being made to pueblos and show that you don't have a lot of people being there for repair. So the abandonment of Mesa Verde is not as rapid as some people say. It was complete. The other thing too is that if you Weather Hill, I think what he found,
Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, when he found that stuff and he found all those pots there, he carried the heaviest thing in his furthest. You're not going to carry all those pots away. Maybe you do have an idea you're going to come back. Why you're going to come back, you take them with you. But the abandonment has something to do with social, political, or environmental change. And you don't know. You now know what can happen if you have. Because we've experienced it, everybody has experienced what happens if you have a pandemic come through, but we don't have evidence of that either. So there's, it's very difficult.
Are you asking about whether or not they had granaries?
I think they did.
Yeah, they did. They had elaborate granaries, and some of them were behind the building.
Right.
So that was question posed by granaries. Yeah, they had and every First Nation that lived in the Pueblos, the ancient ancestors. Ancient Pueblo ancestors, they all had phenomenal granary storage systems.
It's just giving you so much respect for the durability of the people. Is that what you want?
Resilience.
Resilience and stuff like that. I mean, today's society, no way. I mean, you're done in 2 days, because you can't go to Walmart, Say, it's your food,
I would make this joke, but I won't.
Huh?
We're in Mongolia, we can't go to Safeway or no place
Right.
like that, so we paid a neighbor to butcher the sheep for us. I have to put this as an aside. So when we first got there, I think we paid $100 a sheep or something like that. But they got cell phones and they'd call a commodity market in Ulaanbaatar to see how much they were getting for sheep in Ulaanbaatar, and that's what we paid for up there. Yeah.
The city prices.
City guys, yeah. It's really fun. I love our friends.
If there's anybody on Zoom that would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute.
I have a question. I don't know. Can you guys hear me in the page center?
And
I'm curious, at the end of the presentation, you offered a hypothesis about the extended hunting trips that the granaries were used to allow them to make longer trips and stay out longer. Are you seeing an absence of habitation sites that would suggest that they weren't living there for much of the year?
Good question. And actually, the granaries are smaller where this is occurring, but I got to be careful about saying they're smaller in general. But the type of habitation site changes. There are more ephemeral type of habitation, like wickiups with hydro on the top of them, or other things. But we do find habitation sites there. So you would say specifically where they're at, it's a higher elevation because the snows get so deep. It would be, and they're continuously deep. They don't have the melt. They don't have the melt in the winter. So you have to get out of there because most of the game leaves. I mean, you could stay if you have those granaries there, but I think that they're there for process of working. But I think there's an elaborate process that works in those. The first granary that I showed you, the one I talked about having to hike in pretty far, just south of there, they hunt deer and they gather Gambel's oak. The Gambel's oak has to be processed because it has tannic acids in it. And what we think is that they followed the deer up and they got deer and Gambel's oak because it has less tannic acid in it. So they had those items to get there. So I think they're different. It's different. They have habitation sites there. Is that the direct answer to the question? Because I kind of went down about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just kind of a follow-up. What are the elevations of the granaries all over the place, or were you looking at some that were kind of within a specific zone of elevation?
So to take and add in that last group there, they span between about 4,800, 5,280 is a better way to put it. About 1 mile high, because I think that's what brings me that between 4,800 feet above sea level, and they go up to about 7,500.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
you want to take us home?
Absolutely. Well, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Gardner. I certainly learned a lot. I hope everybody else did as well. Once again, I just wanted to say thanks for joining us. And if you've got ideas for future Comet Talks, please let us know. Speak up, or we'll be sending an evaluation out and you could jot down some ideas on the evaluation. But I think that's it for now. So once again, thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.